There's a moment in the life of an empire when the ledger tells the future, not the headlines, not the wars, the budget. Historian Niall Ferguson calls it the limit, the point when a nation spends more on debt service than on defense, when interest payments crowd out military readiness, when past borrowing overtakes present power. 2024, the United States crossed that line. This isn't about ideology, it's about arithmetic. And what happens when superpower status meets compounding interest?
A quiet budget milestone. Something that might just echo across centuries, potentially defining an era.
It sounds dramatic, but it might actually be that significant.
Right. In fiscal year 2024, the United States reached this point where it spent more money just servicing its national debt, paying the interest on past borrowing than it did on its entire national defense budget.
More on interest than on the military. That's the headline.
Think about that. The cost of yesterday's credit card bill, basically, commanded a larger slice of the federal pie than the budget for the nation's military. The part tasked with current security, global power projection.
It's a really profound shift.
Yeah.
And it's a threshold crossed for the first time in the entire post-World War II era for the U.S.
Yeah, you could almost say it's the moment when interest payments finally eclipsed cannon fire. Or maybe the empire's sword starts to rust in the shadow of its credit card bill.
That's a stark way to put it, but it captures the essence. And what's fascinating, or maybe alarming, is how this physical fact lines up with this powerful historical pattern, something historian Neil Ferguson talks about.
Ferguson's Law.
Ferguson's Law. He basically posits that when a state starts spending more on servicing its debt than it does on defense, it enters this zone of, significant strategic risk. It could potentially face the decline of its status as a top-tier empire.
So it's this specific budgetary crossover point that historically has often signaled hard times ahead, maybe even the end of great power status.
That's the core argument, based on historical observation. It's a big warning sign.
So that's the hook, and it's definitely loaded with implications. For this, we're going to explore this juncture in U.S. history. We'll look at it through the lens of history, economics, strategic theory.
Yeah, we've got a good stack of sources here: historical accounts, recent U.S. budget data, expert analysis. We can really dig in.
So what is this Ferguson's Law? How did it play out for past empires? We're talking Habsburg, Spain, right? Borrowing against all that New World silver.
Them, Bourbon France, the Ottomans, even the British Empire, navigating the huge costs of global wars.
Yeah.
We'll look at those cases.
And then bring it to the U.S. What's the specific data? What are the drivers behind the U.S. hitting this threshold in FY 2024? What does it mean for the budget, national security, America's global standing?
And the big question, really, can the U.S., with its unique economic strengths, its unique global position, can it actually defy this historical pattern?
Or is it facing a truly perilous turning point where, past debts start dictating future capacity, maybe even its global destiny?
It's a complex, urgent question, deep historical roots. And understanding it means diving into the data, the theory, and those historical lessons.
All right, let's get into it. Let's start with the core idea, Ferguson's Law. What is it really at its heart?
At its heart, Ferguson's Law posits that when a state dedicates more resources to servicing its accumulated debt than it does to its military expenditure, its days as a top-tier empire are effectively numbered. It's a warning sign.
And Ferguson's specific phrasing is pretty direct, isn't it?
It is, quite pointed. He says, any great power that spends more on debt service than on defense risks ceasing to be a great power. And he calls the Ferguson limit precisely this threshold, that point where the interest payments on the national debt exceed military spending.
So it's literally that moment the lines cross on the budget chart. One line is paying off the past, the other is securing the present and future. But what's the underlying logic? Why that specific ratio? Why is it considered so strategically important, maybe even more than debt to GDP?
The logic is pretty straightforward, almost stark, really, and it gets to the core function of a state. Large interest payments on debt, they just siphon off scarce government resources, money that has to be paid.
Non-negotiable payments.
So that leaves significantly less funding available for, maintaining and modernizing armies, navies, air forces, intelligence capabilities, making those strategic investments in tech, infrastructure alliances, things that underpin military power and project influence.
So the imbalance actively weakens its grip.
In Ferguson's view, yes, it actively pulls apart the geopolitical grip of a great power, making it inherently more vulnerable. vulnerable to challenges from rivals outside, and maybe even instability or revolts inside.
It's like that analogy you hear if an empire is pouring more into past debts than present security.
It's effectively eating its seed corn, sacrificing future strategic strength for past financial obligations. It's prioritizing yesterday over tomorrow in a strategic sense.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just some economic number on a page, it's a direct indicator of whether a state is prioritizing past bills over present and future security.
Precisely. And, while Neil Ferguson formalized this as a law, the core worry about debt undermining state capacity isn't totally new. He actually mentions Adam Ferguson, no relation, an 18th century thinker who had similar warnings.
Oh, interesting. What did Adam Ferguson say?
He cautioned that debt built up gradually over time is extremely dangerous in the hands of a precipitant and ambitious administration. Basically, ministers might borrow heavily, hoping the crash or the reckoning comes later, maybe on someone else's watch.
Kicking the can down the road.
But that doesn't make the slow, stealthy buildup of debt and interest any less dangerous in the long run. It just makes it easier for current politicians to, defer the problem.
So now Ferguson focuses on this debt to defense ratio specifically because it frames fiscal health in strategic hard power terms.
Yes, he really highlights this ratio because it shifts the focus. It moves away from just broad solvency measures like debt to GDP, which are useful, to the direct impact of fiscal strain on the state's ability to project power and ensure its own security.
So debt to GDP tells you if you can pay your bills, but debt to defense tells you if paying those bills is crippling your ability to defend yourself.
That's a good way to put it. The moment interest payments exceed military spending is that point where, historically, an empire's decline seems to become much more likely, maybe even irreversible, or at least accelerates sharply. Because, as Ferguson says, that crushing debt burden draws scarce resources towards itself, reducing the amount available for national security. It's this powerful, non-discretionary pull on resources that directly competes with the military budget, which is often seen as discretionary, even though it's strategically vital.
Is this an ironclad law, though? Like, does it happen every single time, no exceptions? Or is it more of a strong historical trend?
Yeah, that's important to clarify. Ferguson himself describes it more as a strong historical regularity, a powerful correlation seen across many cases, rather than some kind of deterministic law that applies rigidly every time.
So there are nuances.
Definitely. He notes, for instance, that temporary breaches of this limit can happen, especially during something like a total war, where both government borrowing and military spending spike dramatically at the same time.
Wartime spikes are different.
They are. The real danger, according to the theory, is remaining beyond that limit in peacetime, year after year, or failing to correct the fiscal imbalance quickly and decisively after a war ends, when those high interest payments continue to constrain budgets. It's the sustained imbalance that seems to be the killer.
Why is spending more on interest than defense such a powerful warning sign? What are the actual mechanisms? How does this fiscal imbalance erode an empire's power?
Well, past empires give us some stark clues. High debt costs often come from financing really expensive wars or maybe ambitious imperial projects with loans. When those bills come due, not just the principal, but the annual interest leaders face this really harsh trade-off.
Pay the bankers or fund the army?
Basically, yes. Do you keep paying the creditors to maintain financial stability and access to future borrowing? Or do you slash other spending, primarily discretionary areas like the military, to free up cash? When interest eats up a large and growing chunk of revenue, military spending is often the first major area to face cutbacks or chronic underinvestment.
And over time, that adds up.
Hugely. Over time, this leads to forces that are, undermanned, poorly equipped, maybe technologically falling behind rivals. They become unable to respond effectively to new threats or even just maintain existing commitments. Plus, this high debt load and the fiscal stress it creates can really undermine confidence, both among your own citizens and foreign investors, in the state's financial stability.
Which makes borrowing even more expensive.
Potentially triggering a vicious cycle. Rising debt service costs force more austerity, which weakens power, which further damages confidence, making borrowing even costlier, and so on.
It sounds like this sort of slow, insidious process that maybe doesn't seem urgent day to day until suddenly a real threat pops up and you realize you're not ready.
That's often how it plays out. Ferguson points out that policymakers often have this short-term focus when borrowing. They might take on debt in emergencies or maybe even for politically popular programs, just hoping that, future economic growth or future governments will somehow figure out how to pay for it.
The debt gets gradually laid, as Adam Ferguson put it.
Right. It isn't always felt immediately or politically toxic to create. But it builds up stealthily, especially if interest rates rise, until one day those interest costs just start crowding out the budget for everything else, including the essential functions like defense.
And by the time you realize you can't afford the military you need.
It might be too late. Too late to stave off powerful rivals, or suppress internal rebellions, or even just maintain those vast territorial or economic commitments. The debt-to-defense ratio, in this view, serves as that early alarm bell for imbalanced priorities, where fiscal necessity starts forcing strategic retreat. History, across many cases, shows that exceeding this ratio for too long leads not just to economic problems, but to strategic retreat, internal crisis, or even state collapse.
Just to recap the core idea of Ferguson's Law, it's this powerful warning signal. The moment a state's interest payments on its debt surpass its military spending.
That crossover point.
And the strategic logic is stark. This fiscal imbalance directly diverts scarce resources away from maintaining hard power. It weakens the military, increases vulnerability, and ultimately tends to erode an empire's power over time. You're basically paying for the past instead of securing the future.
Precisely. It's the balance sheet directly impacting the battlefield, or maybe more subtly, impacting the ability to even get to the battlefield or deter threats effectively in the first place.
Let's transition now and look at how this theory, this pattern, has actually played out. Let's go from Habsburg Spain in the 16th century all the way to maybe Washington today. What happened when these empires crossed that specific red line?
A really cautionary tale that stands out immediately, often cited as the first clear example, is Habsburg Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's often presented as the first major European power effectively bankrupted by debt, an early warning.
Even with all that silver flowing in from the Americas, they were a superpower then, right?
They were, fueled by New World silver, projecting power across Europe, the Americas. And it's a big address, but they also racked up enormous war debts. They financed their famous infantry, the tercias that dominated battlefields, and their great naval fleets, the armadas, through complex financial instruments. Things like long-term bonds called juros and short-term loans, asientos, often from Genoese and German bankers.
So the silver wasn't enough to cover the costs of constant warfare.
Not at all. The wars were incredibly expensive. And here's the key point for Ferguson's Law. By the late 1500s, interest payments on Spain's debt were consuming over 40% of its annual revenues. Just unsustainable given its vast global commitments.
Wow, 40% just on interest.
Yeah. And the first time this became undeniably apparent was in the period around 1575 to 1583. Under King Philip II, Spain became the first great power in history to explicitly cross the Ferguson limit. Debt service costs definitively overtook military spending. In fact, Philip II famously declared bankruptcy in 1575 because he just couldn't service his debts anymore.
He declared bankruptcy as King of Spain.
Yes, the first of several such declarations during his reign, actually. It happened again in 1557 and 1596, too. It shows the depth of the fiscal crisis.
What were the consequences of that crossover for Spain? The immediate ones and the long-term ones?
They were dire, and they went way beyond just the finances. Servicing that massive debt ate up such a huge share of revenue that it directly and severely weakened the crown's ability to fund its army and navy effectively.
So soldiers weren't getting paid, ships weren't getting built.
Yeah. Military pay often fell into arrears, modernization lagged behind rivals, and just maintaining forces across that vast empire became increasingly difficult. Now, there were some brief moments right after some of those defaults where debt payments were temporarily suspended, where Spain had a primary budget surplus. But the relief was always short-lived.
Why?
Because the underlying costs didn't go away. The imperial budget remained chronically overstretched by the need to maintain garrisons across Europe, defend those far-flung colonies, and continue fighting necessary wars. The fundamental imbalance remained.
So the money just wasn't reliably there for defense, even when strategically vital.
Precisely. Fiscal constraint directly hit military capacity. And as that financial weakness undercut Spain's hard power and its state capacity, military setbacks and territorial losses started mounting across the empire.
Like the war with the Dutch.
Spain got locked into prolonged wars. It simply couldn't afford to prosecute effectively anymore. It ultimately lost the 80 Years' War, which lasted from 1568 to 1648, to the upstart Dutch Republic. The Dutch, by the way, had been much more prudent managing their own finances.
And that loss marked a turning point.
A major one. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 formally forced Spain to recognize Dutch independence. That really marked the effective end of Spanish dominance in Europe. Then, just over a decade later, the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 forced Spain to cede key territories to France, further confirming its diminished status.
So the lesson from Spain seems pretty clear. Cross the Ferguson limit, stay there, and fiscal ruin translates into strategic defeat and the slow erosion of empire.
That's the takeaway. Once Spain's debt cost surpassed its military budget for a sustained period, despite the silver, the empire entered this phase of seemingly irreversible decline. Over-reliance on borrowed money led to chronic insolvency, underfunded defenses, and this gradual erosion of its power. Spain is really an archetypal example of a great power unable to recover after crossing that debt over defense threshold. Fiscal ruin led directly to strategic defeat.
And Ferguson specifically links Spain's retreat to this imbalance.
He does. He notes, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, that Spain's experience is a stark warning against crossing the Ferguson limit for a sustained period. As debt servicing costs consumed more and more revenue, the state's ability to fund its military commitments was eroded. And this growing imbalance between fiscal obligations and strategic needs inexorably forced geopolitical retreat.
That comparison to the Dutch Republic is really striking. Fighting the same long war, but with totally different fiscal management and ultimately different strategic outcome.
It is. The Dutch succeeded partly because they avoided this specific trap. During their long fight for independence and their golden age that followed, they were willing to take drastic steps like suspending interest payments in emergencies, specifically to prioritize the war effort.
They put defense first, even if it meant stiffing creditors temporarily.
When necessary, yes. And importantly, they consistently spent more on their army and navy than on debt interest from 1575 right through to 1713, except for one brief peaceful period. They also developed sophisticated financial tools and managed to maintain investor confidence even while financing war, which kept their borrowing costs relatively low compared to Spain.
So the Dutch Golden Age rose as the Spanish Empire fell, and Ferguson's law helps explain why.
It offers a powerful lens on that divergence. Financial prudence versus fiscal overreach had massive strategic consequences.
Let's move to another huge European power with a history of debt and, well, traumatic upheaval. Bourbon France.
Ah, yes. Bourbon France in the late 18th century. Another classic case, and arguably even more dramatic in its immediate consequences, of collapse after breaching the Ferguson limit. Under Louis XIV and his successors, France pursued continental dominance, built Versailles, all incredibly expensive stuff.
Leading to huge debts from constant war.
Wars like the War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, these racked up enormous debts. But the absolute breaking point, the thing that really tipped them over the edge fiscally, came when France decided to fund the American War of Independence.
Largely on credit, right, to stick it to Britain.
Precisely. Funded mostly on credit, specifically to weaken its great rival, Britain. Deeply ironic, as you said, that helping the U.S. achieve independence contributed so directly to France's own fatal fiscal crisis.
So that massive borrowing pushed them way over the Ferguson limit.
Way over. By the 1780s, just servicing the national debt was consuming over 50%, half of the French state's annual budget. Far more than military spending, far more than administrative costs.
Half the budget just on interest?
Yeah, look at the figures from 1788, right on the eve of the revolution. Interest payments actually exceeded half of all government expenditures. Meanwhile, the War Ministry, it was languishing at under 25% of spending.
So France was spending twice as much paying for past debts as it was on current defense and running the country.
This immense debt burden just crowded out vital spending and created this pressing, undeniable fiscal and political crisis.
And they couldn't fix it. They couldn't reform their way out.
They couldn't. The monarchy, under Louis XVI, basically spiraled into insolvency and political chaos because it was unable to restore fiscal balance. There were efforts to reform the tax system, which was deeply unfair, famously exempting the powerful nobles and clergy, but they came way too late and faced fierce resistance from those very groups.
So the crown couldn't raise the money needed to cover the interest payments.
Not without either imposing new taxes on the privileged classes, which they resisted fiercely, or calling the Estates General, France's long-dormant representative assembly. And calling the Estates General was seen as incredibly risky, likely to provoke even more resistance.
And the result was?
The French Revolution of 1789. Triggered in large part by the state's bankruptcy and the public's fury at decades of mismanaged, deeply inequitable finances.
So in France, fiscal breakdown led directly to regime change, revolution.
Yes, a rapid and violent consequence. In Ferguson's terms, Bourbon France sharply exceeded the Ferguson limit and quickly lost its ability to govern, ultimately losing its very existence in that form. Fiscal breakdown translated directly into regime collapse.
It's a stark contrast again with Britain at the time, their main rival.
It really is. Britain avoided a similar fate, partly by leveraging more effective financial institutions like the Bank of England and a broader, more politically legitimate tax base that had the backing of Parliament. This allowed London to service its own large war debts more smoothly and sustain its fight against France.
Because the British system had more buy-in.
Arguably, yes. Unlike Britain's parliament-backed tax system, the French monarchy's failure to equitably tax the elites made its debt unsustainable. It eroded public trust and investor confidence. Once France's interest costs blew past military spending, the ancient regime just lacked any viable path to recovery. The old regime fell.
And France did eventually rebound, but not through peaceful fiscal reform.
Right. France rebounded dramatically under Napoleon later, but that came via revolution, war, and dictatorship, not a peaceful fiscal turnaround. The French case really underscores how crossing that debt service threshold can rapidly translate into political revolution and the end of an imperial era, especially when you have those underlying social and political tensions simmering.
Two major European empires seem weakened or brought down by letting interests consume more than defense. What about the Ottoman Empire? Another vast, multi-ethnic state facing modernization challenges in the 19th century.
The Ottoman Empire is another powerful example. It really demonstrates how sustained debt overload, especially when combined with increasing dependence on foreign money, can fatally weaken an empire. By the mid-1800s, the Ottomans were really struggling to modernize their military and economy to keep up with the European powers.
Facing budget shortfalls?
Persistent ones, yeah. Made worse by corruption and inefficiency. So they started borrowing heavily from European creditors, particularly British and French bankers. This ramped up especially during and after the costly Crimean War in the 1850s. This growing reliance on foreign loans just led to mounting interest obligations that the Ottoman treasury could barely handle.
So they were borrowing just to keep the lights on, or maybe worse, to fight wars they couldn't really afford.
Precisely. Over several decades, the Ottoman government, the Sublime Porte, fought multiple wars against Russia, dealing with Balkan rebellions almost entirely on borrowed funds. Each conflict just added significantly to the debt burden and the interest payments that followed.
And eventually that crossed the Ferguson limit too.
Massively. By the 1870s, the Ottoman state's debt servicing costs had grown to over half of its entire annual budget, a clear, undeniable breach of the limit. They were spending more paying interest to British and French bankers than they were on their own army and administration combined.
That sounds completely unsustainable.
It was. And it triggered a crisis. In October 1875, facing totally empty coffers, the Ottoman government was forced to suspend interest payments, an outright sovereign default on about $200 million in debt.
And that default, I imagine, had consequences beyond just the financial markets.
And they were devastating for Ottoman sovereignty. The default brought humiliation, yes, but also a profound loss of financial autonomy. European creditor nations, backed by their governments, weren't happy.
They stepped in.
They did. They demanded control and imposed something called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA, in 1881. This was this extraordinary council, mostly foreign officials, who took direct control over key Ottoman revenue sources, things like customs duties, taxes on salt and tobacco.
To make sure the foreign creditors got paid back first.
The empire effectively surrendered a huge chunk of its financial sovereignty and administrative control of foreign powers. Meanwhile, with over half the budget legally tied up by the debt charges and under OPDA control, the Ottoman military was just chronically underfunded, starved of investment.
So while Europe was industrializing its armies,
the Ottomans fell further and further behind. They couldn't afford the new technologies, the training, the supplies. Their forces suffered one defeat after another in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, crushed by Russia in 1877-78, setbacks in North Africa, disastrous defeats in the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, largely because the empire simply lacked the financial resources to modernize or even adequately supply its troops compared to its rivals.
And that prolonged fiscal weakness, that underfunding, contributed directly to its final end in World War I.
Ultimately, yes. The weakened Ottoman Empire, financially hobbled, strategically vulnerable, just couldn't withstand the pressures of World War I. It entered the war as a junior partner to Germany and basically collapsed entirely by 1922, its territories carved up by the victors.
So once that interest burden eclipsed military spending and foreign control came in,
the empire entered a terminal decline. Financial insolvency, external financial control, they just drained its strength and flexibility, leaving it vulnerable internally and externally. There was no real recovery, just this managed receivership under the OPDA, followed by complete fragmentation. The Ottoman case really reinforces how breaching that threshold, especially when dealing with lots of foreign debt and geopolitical pressure, can basically turn an empire into a protectorate and seal its fate.
One more historical case before we turn to the present day. Austria-Hungary, another complex, multi-ethnic empire facing internal tensions, external pressures, leading right up to World War I.
It is, and it's another really poignant example of an imperial power that failed to escape decline after debt effectively overtook defense and its budget priorities. Austria-Hungary had this particularly complex fiscal structure because of the dual monarchy setup from 1867 power divided between Austria and Hungary.
Which made things inefficient.
Often, yes. It led to inefficient revenue collection, constant disputes over who paid for what, and persistent deficits at the imperial level, the level responsible for the army and foreign policy. The empire had heavy military commitments, maintaining a large army to police its diverse regions, deterring rivals like Germany, Russia, Italy. But its cumbersome financial system really struggled to keep pace with these demands, or with the demands of military modernization happening elsewhere.
So military needs were high, but the money wasn't consistently or efficiently there to meet them.
And by the early 20th century, particularly in the 1900s leading up to World War I, Austria-Hungary repeatedly breached the Ferguson limit. What this meant in practice was that Vienna often prioritized making interest payments on its growing public debt over necessary new spending on the army and navy year after year.
So the Habsburg military fell behind.
It became chronically underfunded as a result. It lagged significantly in weaponry, in training, in overall size compared to its major rivals like Germany and Russia, right on the eve of the war. While other powers were locked in this naval and arms race, Austria-Hungary was fiscally constrained, trying to make ends meet while servicing its debt.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster, heading into a massive war involving all those rivals.
It was. And that lack of preparedness showed up immediately when the empire entered World War I. Despite its long military history, Austria-Hungary struggled badly against better equipped, better prepared foes right from the start. Its armies performed poorly, suffered devastating, unsustainable losses against Russia on the Eastern Front and in the Balkans against Serbia.
And the finances just collapsed under the strain of war.
Completely. Already overstretched before the war by that debt service burden, the empire's finances utterly broke under the demands of total war. Inflation soared, debt piled even higher, both domestic and foreign. By the end of the war in 1918, Austria-Hungary was financially bankrupt and politically shattered. It just couldn't hold its multi-ethnic territories together anymore.
And the empire just disintegrated.
Into several successor states. It lost vast amounts of territory. Its great power status vanished.
So that pre-war fiscal weakness, prioritizing debt service over defense investment, was a key factor in its wartime collapse.
Fundamentally, yes. Austria-Hungary's pre-war fiscal weakness, that persistent pattern of servicing debt, instead of adequately investing in military strength or infrastructure or economic resilience, it left the empire in no position to weather a major conflict or compete effectively with its better resourced neighbors. Once it crossed into spending more on debt interest than defense, the imperial government just lacked the capacity to reverse course or build the necessary hard power.
Reforms were too little, too late.
Half-hearted attempts came too late. The shock of war simply finished what decades of prioritizing debt over defense had started. Like the other empires we discussed, Austria-Hungary failed to recover after breaching the Ferguson Threshold. It ultimately succumbed to that combination of financial exhaustion, military defeat, and internal fragmentation.
It's a really stark contrast to Germany, its neighbor and ally in World War I.
It is. The German Empire, after unification in 1871, built an incredibly powerful military through significant investment. And notably, Germany largely kept its public debt manageable. It never let interest costs strangle its defense spending in the way Austria-Hungary did. Germany prioritized defense and economic growth.
While Austria-Hungary was hampered by its debt.
Austria-Hungary's case really underscores the profound consequences of spending decades on the wrong side of this debt-to-defense ratio. It doesn't just weaken a state externally compared to rivals. As Ferguson argues, it also tends to exacerbate internal weaknesses. For Austria-Hungary, scarce funds meant tough political choices about which regions or ethnic groups to invest in or prioritize. That bred resentment, fueled ethnic tensions, increased disunity internally. Its imperial twilight was really illuminated by that red glow of fiscal danger, arguably, a self-inflicted wound.
Let's pause and look back at these historical examples again. Like, we've got Spain, France, the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary. And the pattern seems pretty consistent, doesn't it?
It really does.
Crossing the Ferguson limit, spending more on debt interest than defense, led to underfunded military, strategic losses, major political upheaval, ranging from bankruptcy and foreign financial control to outright revolution and disintegration, and ultimately imperial decline or collapse. It's a powerful recurring theme in history across different kinds of empires, different eras.
It is. The historical evidence, when you line it up like this, strongly supports that correlation between letting debt service consistently eclipse military spending and the subsequent erosion of a great power's capacity and influence. The pattern is striking in its consistency across centuries.
Which brings us right back to the modern day, back to the United States. And let's introduce that startling fact again. This historical pattern, where interest payments eclipse military spending, well, it reached a critical point in U.S. federal finances in fiscal year 2024.
And according to the sources we're looking at, this is the first time this specific crossover has happened in the entire post-World War II era for the United States.
A historical first for the modern U.S., and multiple sources confer this happened in FY 2024.
Yes, FY 2024 seems to be the watershed year. Now, the exact numbers might vary slightly depending on the source or precisely how you define defense spending. Some count only discretionary budget authority, others include more. But there's a clear consensus across reputable analyses that the crossover occurred in FY 2024.
Can you give us some of those numbers?
Sure. For instance, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, they put FY 2024 estimated interest costs at around $881 billion versus defense spending at $855 billion. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, using CBO projections, estimated interest at $870 billion against $852 billion for defense.
Similar ballpark, interest higher in both.
The Bipartisan Policy Center cited about $882 billion for interest versus $874 billion for defense discretionary spending. And even the CBO's own official monthly budget review for the full FY 2024 period showed net interest outlays reaching a massive $949 billion, well above any comparable defense figure for the year.
So regardless of the exact figures, the crossover in FY 2024 is clear. Interest beat defense.
Undeniable across these analyses using consistent definitions.
And you stressed earlier, this is more than just like an accounting note or some statistical blip. This feels significant.
It represents a really substantive, fundamental shift in the nation's fiscal priorities, at least as reflected in the budget outcome. The obligation to service past debt now commands more federal resources money that must be paid to bondholders than the budget specifically allocated through the annual appropriations process to national defense.
And it happened relatively quickly, didn't it? The warnings were there, but the final jump was fast.
That's what's particularly noteworthy, the recency and the rapidity of this shift.
Yeah.
Fiscal analysts have been warning about this possibility for years, yeah? Projections often pointed towards a crossover around 2024 or 2025. But the actual pace of change accelerated dramatically just in the preceding few years.
How dramatically?
Well, net interest spending nearly doubled just between FY 2020 and FY 2023. Went from $345 billion up to $659 billion in just 3 years, before making that huge leap to over $880 billion, that means $949 billion, depending on the measure, in FY 2024.
Wow, doubling in 3 years, then another huge jump.
It really demonstrates how the fiscal landscape can change incredibly swiftly. It's due to both those underlying long-term trends, but also short-term shocks and, importantly, policy responses to those shocks.
You mentioned historical U.S. data earlier. How does FY 2024 compare to, say, the Cold War peaks or other points in U.S. history when defense spending was really high?
Yeah, if you look back, the contrast highlights just how unusual FY 2024 is. For example, back in 1940, right before the huge WWII defense buildup, defense spending was already nearly double interest payments. Yeah, tiny numbers then, but the ratio mattered.
And during the Cold War.
In 1960, at the height of the Cold War arms race, defense spending dwarfed interest costs. It was over 6 times higher. Think $48 billion for defense versus just $7.7 billion for interest. Even in 1980, during another Cold War surge and facing high interest rates, defense spending was still well over twice the cost of interest.
And that pattern held for a long time. Defense comfortably exceeding interest.
It held right through the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. Even as recently as 2020, defense spending at $714 billion was still well above interest payments at $345 billion. So this dramatic recent divergence, culminating in the 2024 crossover and is projected to continue in 2025, and beyond, it really highlights just how significant this change is compared to the historical norm for the entire post-WWII era. It's a complete reversal of historical budget priorities between these two major categories.
So what are the powerful forces driving this? Why did this crossover happen now in 2024? What pushed interest costs up so dramatically while defense didn't keep pace?
The drivers are really these powerful converging forces. They've pushed up interest costs dramatically, while defense spending, although large, operates within its own set of constraints. We can basically break it down into two main areas. First, the rapid ascent of debt servicing costs, that's the primary driver. And second, the evolution of military spending within its own political and fiscal constraints.
Let's take the debt servicing costs first. That seems to be the main engine behind this whole shift.
It is the single most significant factor. And this big increase is a direct result of two interconnected things hitting at the same time. First, the sheer volume of outstanding national debt, which has grown massively. And second, the significant increase in the interest rates being applied to that debt.
The debt volume itself, that's the result of decades of borrowing, but maybe exacerbated recently.
Yes, the U.S. has seen this substantial buildup of public debt over recent decades. It's been driven by both spending increases and tax cuts that haven't really been matched by enough revenue growth. Historically, big spikes in debt were often linked mainly to wars or deep recessions.
But recently it's grown even in good economic times.
That's the key difference. The more recent trend shows persistent growth in debt, even during periods of economic expansion. That indicates underlying structural imbalances between what the federal government spends and what it takes in. And the projections are stark. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, projects that federal debt held by the public, which was already high at 97% of GDP at the end of FY 2023, is going to rise to about 100% of GDP in FY 2025 and keep climbing rapidly, hitting maybe 118% by 2035.
Higher than after World War II.
That level would actually surpass the previous historical peak, which is right after World War II, around 106% of GDP in 1946. So we're heading into unprecedented territory for peacetime debt levels relative to the economy.
And you mentioned certain recent fiscal policies, say from 2021 to 2023, that significantly accelerated this debt accumulation.
Several key policies and economic events during that window really added to the debt pile quickly. For example, building on earlier pandemic relief, the American Rescue Plan, ARP, in 2021 provided substantial additional fiscal stimulus. The CBO estimated it would increase deficits by roughly $1.9 trillion over a decade.
That's a big number. What else?
Then there was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, later in 2021, a major bipartisan investment in infrastructure, but still projected to add about $256 billion to the deficit over 10 years, despite its goals of boosting long-term growth.
Now, what about the Inflation Reduction Act? I remember that one was really heavily debated in terms of its fiscal impact. Some said it reduced the deficit, others argued it actually increased it.
It was, and its actual fiscal impact has definitely become a subject of considerable debate and importantly revised estimates since it passed. The CBO's initial score, when the law was passed, projected a net deficit reduction of about $305 billion over 10 years. That was mainly expected to come from prescription drug savings and increased IRS tax enforcement revenue.
But that estimate changed.
Subsequent analyses, particularly looking at how the clean energy tax credits were designed, many are uncapped, suggest the actual uptake and the resulting cost could be much, much higher than initially projected. This could potentially lead to a much smaller deficit reduction or maybe even increased deficits over the decade.
So the subsidies might cost more than planned.
That's the argument. The Cato Institute, for example, using external analysis, estimated the energy subsidies alone could cost anywhere between $936 billion and almost $2 trillion over 10 years, vastly exceeding those initial CBO projections. And significantly, in 2024, the CBO itself did a reevaluation, factoring in higher than expected uptake of those green energy credits. They suggested the IRA could potentially increase the deficit by $300 billion over the decade instead of reducing it.
Wow, that's a big swing. From deficit reduction to deficit increase.
It really shows how hard it can be to accurately project the fiscal impact of complex legislation, especially when it involves behavioral responses like taking up tax credits. The final cost can really depend on implementation and the economic response.
So the impact of the IRA is debated, potentially adding to debt growth, contrary to initial claims.
That's a fair summary of the updated understanding of its fiscal score, yeah. And layering onto all of this, you still have the ongoing impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, from 2017.
The Trump tax cuts.
Right. While enacted earlier, its reductions in corporate and individual income tax rates have had this continued effect of lowering federal revenues as a share of GDP compared to what they would have been under previous law. And a lot of its individual tax provisions are set to expire after 2025.
And extending those would cost a lot more.
Hugely. The political and economic debate over whether to make those expiring cuts permanent without offsetting spending cuts or other revenue increases contributes significantly to the projected long-term debt growth. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimates that making those provisions permanent would add about $4 trillion to deficits just over the next decade, FY 2025 to FY 2034.
$4 trillion. That's enormous.
It is. And all of this increased borrowing from these specific policy choices sits on top of that underlying automatic spending growth from the big entitlement programs,
Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
driven primarily by the aging population and rising healthcare costs per person. Federal revenues just haven't kept pace with this accelerated growth in total spending from both these mandatory programs and all these discretionary policy choices on spending and taxes.
So it's a combination of factors leading to more debt principal.
It's the compounding effect. Policy decisions, more spending, arguably less revenue than prior law layered onto existing structural imbalances, plus demographic trends, all leading to this rapid expansion of the debt principal that now needs servicing, often at higher interest rates. It really underscores that the current fiscal challenge isn't just one event or one law, but a series of decisions and trends whose cumulative impact is now hitting hard in the form of those soaring interest payments.
That covers the volume of debt, which has clearly grown significantly. The other part you mentioned was the interest rates themselves, and rates have gone up really sharply in the last couple of years, haven't they?
They have, and that's the second and perhaps the most immediate driver of the FY 2024 crossover. After a long period of historically low interest rates, think post-2008 financial crisis, and through the subsequent decade, the whole economic landscape shifted dramatically, starting in 2022.
Because of inflation.
Primarily, yes, driven by the Federal Reserve's aggressive response to that surge in inflation, which hit levels we hadn't seen in decades. The PCE index, which the Fed watches closely, peaked at 7.2% year over year back in June 2022. So the Fed hit the brakes.
Raising rates hard and fast.
They embarked on this aggressive monetary tightening cycle, implementing a series of substantial and rapid increases in the federal funds rate target range, starting in March 2022 and continuing right through 2023.
And that directly impacts the government's borrowing costs, sometimes very quickly.
These Fed actions had a direct and significant upward effect on interest rates right across the board for U.S. Treasury securities. From short-term T-bills maturing in weeks to long-term notes and bonds maturing years down the road, yields went up considerably.
So when the Treasury needed to borrow new money or refinance old debt,
They had to do it at these substantially higher interest rates. And the Treasury is always issuing new debt to finance ongoing deficits and to refinance the trillions of dollars of existing debt that matures every single year. So they've been forced to lock in these higher rates.
which led to that rapid jump in interest payments we saw in FY24.
Precisely. It led to this rapid escalation in net interest outlays. The CBO's monthly budget review for FY 2024 reported that net outlays for interest surged by $239 billion. That's a staggering 34% increase in that single fiscal year alone, hitting that total of $949 billion in their measure.
A 34% increase in 1 year just for interest payments, that number really does stop you in your tracks.
It really highlights the acute sensitivity of federal interest costs to changes in interest rates, especially when you have such a massive and growing stock of outstanding debt. The effective average interest rate the government pays on its total debt has risen significantly. It was remarkably low, around 1.6% just before the pandemic. The pre-pandemic average was maybe 2.49%. Now it's projected to be around 3.37% by early 2025.
And even small rate increases cost billions when the debt is trillions.
Even modest increases in that average rate, when applied to a debt held by the public now exceeding $27 trillion, translate into hundreds of billions of dollars in additional annual interest payments. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget did an estimate. If 10-year Treasury yields just stay elevated around 4.5%, interest payments could exceed the CBO's baseline projections by a cumulative $1.8 trillion through 2034, simply due to higher rates than baseline assumes.
$1.8 trillion extra just from rates staying where they are now.
That's the estimate. It really underscores a significant fiscal vulnerability. The nation's fiscal stability, its ability to fund other priorities like defense, is now highly contingent on the prevailing interest rate environment. And that environment is shaped by both domestic monetary policy trying to control inflation and broader global financial market dynamics and investor sentiment. A swift return to the ultra-low rates of the past decade just doesn't seem likely anytime soon. It's become this powerful, non-discretionary cost driver in the budget.
So the debt servicing costs have soared, driven by both the sheer volume of debt accumulated through policy and underlying trends, and the sharp rise in interest rates due to the Fed's inflation fight. Now, what about the other side of the equation, military spending? How has that evolved within this same fiscal landscape? Why didn't it keep pace?
Well, while debt servicing costs have surged almost uncontrollably, national defense spending has followed a different path. It's certainly substantial in absolute terms, but its evolution is influenced by geopolitical demands and increasingly constrained by domestic priorities and those overall budgetary caps we mentioned.
The U.S. still has the largest defense budget in the world, right?
By far, in absolute dollars. But as a percentage of GDP, the trend has generally been downwards from the Cold War peaks. There were spikes, of course, like after 9/11 or during specific modernization pushes. But the long-term trend relative to the economy has been down or flat compared to historical highs.
What were the recent trends for defense spending leading up to and including FY 2024?
For FY 2023, the figures again vary slightly, but they're generally in the $820 billion to maybe $874 billion range for defense spending, using the standard budget function 050 definition. For FY 2024, the CDO's baseline for national defense, function 050, the figure most comparable to net interest, was $822 billion. Other analyses might cite figures like $855 billion for discretionary defense spending.
So definitely lower than the $870, $949 billion figures for interest in FY 24.
Right. And it's worth noting, some groups like SciPri use broader definitions of military expenditure, including things like military retirement, veterans affairs, defense-related nuclear programs, and they might estimate total U.S. military spending closer to $997 billion for 2024. But for that consistent apples-to-apples comparison with net interest as a single line item in the federal budget, function 050, those lower defense figures, around $822, $855 billion, are the most appropriate ones to use. And it's those figures that confirm the crossover with net interest payments happened in FY24.
And the geopolitical environment demanding military spending has been pretty intense recently, hasn't it? It's not like the world got safer.
Not at all. It's been a complex and demanding security landscape. The period leading up to and including FY 2024 was marked by huge global events. The full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022 led to massive U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine, plus a renewed focus on bolstering NATO and European security, requiring more deployments, more exercises.
In China.
Persistent strategic competition with China remains a central focus. That's driving significant investments in military modernization, trying to maintain tech superiority, adjusting forces in the Indo-Pacific. Plus, you still have ongoing threats from rogue states, transnational terrorists, cyber warfare, all requiring global military presence, operations, and investment in new capabilities.
So the demands on defense are high. But despite those demands, defense spending operates within some significant domestic constraints that seem to be growing tighter.
And this is where that squeeze really becomes apparent. Defense is the largest single category of discretionary spending in the federal budget. That means it's subject to the annual appropriations debate, political negotiation, horse trading.
It's not automatic like entitlements or interest.
And it faces increasing competition for those discretionary dollars, not just from other domestic priorities like education or infrastructure, but more fundamentally, from the relentless automatic growth of mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those are driven by demographics and healthcare costs and basically run on autopilot outside the annual appropriations process.
And now, rising interest payments are another huge non-discretionary claim.
Yes. The rapid rise in non-discretionary net interest payments has introduced another incredibly powerful non-negotiable claimant on federal resources. Interest payments must be made on time and in full, just like Social Security checks have to go out. They take priority over discretionary spending.
And didn't the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, the deal that resolved the debt ceiling fight, add new legal constraints on discretionary spending, including defense?
Yes, it did. The FRA, enacted in June 2023, imposed statutory caps on total discretionary spending for both FY 2024 and FY 2025. These caps directly influence the defense budget negotiations for those years and set specific, relatively tight parameters for overall defense spending in FY 2025, capping national defense funding at $895 billion, even while allowing some flexibility between defense and non-defense within the total discretionary pot.
So you've got this growing, undeniable tension. On one side, a demanding, complex global security landscape that seems to require more investment in defense. On the other side, defense spending getting squeezed by the relentless growth of non-discretionary interest costs and mandatory spending, while also operating within these new statutory caps.
That's the dynamic, and it's really the core of the U.S. fiscal challenge as it relates to Ferguson's law. It strongly suggests that national security funding, being primarily discretionary, could potentially become a casualty of these broader, powerful fiscal pressures that are increasingly dominated by non-discretionary spending.
Meaning, even if threats get worse, the money might not be there.
It's a real risk. Even if geopolitical threats remain constant or even intensify, the capacity to fund defense adequately, to modernize forces, invest in R&D, maintain readiness, project power globally, could be seriously compromised if the underlying fiscal imbalances, especially the soaring cost of debt service, aren't addressed. This really transforms the issue of national debt and interest costs from just an economic or budgetary concern into a fundamental national security challenge. Past fiscal decisions and current fiscal structures are now directly impacting the resources available to safeguard present and future security and Project American power. Fiscal policy is no longer just economics. It's become national security policy.
We've laid out the striking fact.
Yeah.
The U.S. crossed the Ferguson limit in 2024. Interest payments surpassed defense spending for the first time post-WWII. We've looked at the specific data confirming this crossover.
From multiple sources, yeah.
And we've examined the powerful forces driving this shift. On one side, the rapid accumulation of debt from underlying imbalances, plus recent policies like the ARP, IRJA, the debated IRA impact, ongoing TCJRE effects. And that's amplified dramatically by the sharp rise in interest rates from the Fed's inflation fight.
The volume and the cost per unit both shot up.
While on the other side, defense spending operates within a tighter discretionary budget, constrained by these very factors: mandatory spending growth, rising interest, plus those statutory caps from the FRA.
It paints a pretty clear picture of how we got to this significant fiscal turning point, where paying for the past is now claiming more resources than providing for present and future security.
So now the huge question, going back to those historical examples, we saw empires decline after crossing this threshold. Spain, France, the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary. Has any empire ever managed to reverse this decline after reaching this tipping point, after crossing the Ferguson limit? Is there any historical precedent for, escape velocity from this debt spiral?
Well, the historical evidence shows that true, sustained recoveries after consistently crossing this threshold were extremely rare. Most empires that crossed it, like the ones you mentioned, seem to have continued down a path of decline or eventual collapse. However, there's one case that's often described as a notable partial exception.
A partial exception. Okay, who is that?
The British Empire.
Britain. But didn't we just talk about them eventually declining too?
We did, and that's why it's partial. But here's the fascinating part. Britain, in the 18th century, during its long series of incredibly costly wars with France, actually operated beyond the Ferguson limit for a significant period.
Really? Before their big 19th century dominance?
Yes. For example, as early as 1739, interest payments were already around 42% of total government spending, compared to just 39% on the military. By 1792, right before the French Revolutionary Wars kicked off, interest was consuming a whopping 55% of expenditures versus only 37% on defense. So the Hanoverian British state did violate the Ferguson limit for significant stretches in the 18th century, accumulating massive debt from conflicts like the 7 Years' War.
Yet they survived and thrived. Beat France, became the top dog.
They managed not only to survive these periods of intense fiscal strain, but to actually thrive, defeat France in a series of global contests, and emerge from the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 as the undisputed preeminent global power.
How did they manage that when others, like Spain or France later, seemed to just spiral into decline? What were their secrets? What did they do differently?
That's where their specific strategies, their unique institutions, and certain advantages really come into play. These allowed them to achieve this rare, albeit temporary, reversal of the potential decline signaled by the debt burden, and ultimately prolong their dominance for a whole century.
What was key?
One key factor was their robust and innovative financial institutions, coupled with a highly credible credit system. Britain really pioneered modern public finance. Think institutions like the Bank of England, founded way back in 1694. They developed a stable, sophisticated market for government bonds, especially their famous perpetual annuities called consols.
And people trusted the government to pay them back.
Yes. Investors, both British and foreign, largely trust in Parliament to honor the government's debts. This was a big contrast to, say, the French monarchy, which had a history of defaults. This credibility dramatically lowered Britain's borrowing costs compared to its rivals.
So cheap, readily available credit made a huge difference, like a decisive difference.
Huge, decisive. Cheap credit meant Britain could carry a much larger debt load and still afford to fund a first-rate military, especially a Royal Navy, which was its most strategic asset. The Royal Navy grew to be the world's largest and most powerful, even as the national debt mounted significantly throughout the 18th century. That's something cash-strapped, fiscally fragile Bourbon France just couldn't manage, despite having a larger economy and population. Britain could borrow more, cheaper, and still fund its key weapon system.
Sound financial systems, trusted institutions, cheap credit. What else contributed to this unique ability to manage debt and maintain power?
Effective taxation and political support were also crucial. The British government, with Parliament's consent, developed a broad and relatively efficient tax base. This included things like excise taxes on consumption goods, trade tariffs, and later, during the Napoleonic Wars, even an income tax.
And these taxes generated reliable revenue.
Steady, reliable revenue that could be specifically pledged to service the debt. And while these taxes were heavy, they were generally enforced with parliamentary approval, which gave them a degree of political legitimacy in the eyes of the tax-paying public, or at least the politically influential classes.
People tolerated high taxes for debt and war.
Largely, yes, as long as they felt represented in the government making those decisions. This is a key contrast, again, with places like the American colonies, where the lack of representation was a fundamental driver of resistance even over relatively modest taxes, eventually leading to their loss. Importantly, Britain managed to avoid the kind of widespread domestic tax revolt or political paralysis over finances that brought down Bourbon France. This relative political stability at home allowed Britain to keep servicing its debt reliably year after year without facing regime change or a complete breakdown in government.
So, sound finance, trusted institutions, broad and legitimate taxation, public buy-in, that sounds like a strong foundation. It was the bedrock. But another strategy, especially in the 19th century after the Napoleonic Wars, was consistent post-war fiscal discipline. Harvesting the peace dividend, you could call it.
What did that involve? Paying down the debt.
After its major, costly wars, especially after Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, Britain consistently demobilized its forces more rapidly than rivals and really focused on running budget surpluses to actively pay down the national debt. And the debt after 1815 was staggering. The debt-to-GDP ratio soared above 200%.
200%. That's huge. How did they get it down?
Well, partly, the booming Industrial Revolution helped dramatically by expanding GDP, which automatically makes the debt burden smaller relative to the size of the economy. But the government also practiced fiscal restraint. They kept spending relatively tight and ran surpluses whenever possible. This has steadily shrunk the debt burden relative to the economy. By the mid-19th century, the debt-to-GDP ratio was down to around 100%, and it was significantly lower by 1914 on the eve of World War I.
So that restored their fiscal room to maneuver.
Precisely. This long-term financial prudence, this commitment to actually reducing debt in peacetime, was key to Britain remaining the dominant great power throughout the 19th century. You could say Britain gained a second wind and prolonged its global dominance by proactively paying down debt and getting decisively back below the Ferguson limit during its Victorian Golden Age.
In the final piece, you mentioned they consistently prioritized military spending, especially the Navy.
Yes, and this is critical. Even when interest costs were high, or after periods of austerity, they protected defense budgets, especially for the Royal Navy. The Navy was seen as non-negotiable for safeguarding the empire, trade routes, national security.
So the Navy always got funded.
While other areas might face cuts, the Royal Navy consistently received the funding and investment needed to maintain its global superiority. This unique British ability to both service its significant national debt and fund a world-class Navy and Army ensured no rival could easily exploit Britain's fiscal weakness militarily. That's a stark contrast to Spain or the Ottomans, who had to slash defense when debt soared.
So the Pax Britannica was built on that fiscal choice.
The global naval supremacy Britain enjoyed in the 19th century, the Pax Britannica, was a direct outcome of this strategic fiscal choice. Prioritize hard power, especially naval power, even while managing a large debt.
Robust financial systems, sophisticated and legitimate taxation, long-term fiscal discipline in peacetime, and prioritizing the core military need, the Navy. That's how Britain managed to beat the historical trend, at least for a century, and sustain its power despite flirting with the Ferguson limit earlier.
They managed a rare extended period of recovery and dominance. Despite those high debt ratios in the 1700s, Britain emerged from the Napoleonic era as the preeminent world power and held that status for over a century. These fiscal and institutional strengths allowed them to break the typical pattern, temporarily enabling long-term imperial expansion and stability even after incurring massive war debts. Historians often note that Britain's financial revolution really paid for its military revolution and its global empire.
But you keep calling it a partial exception. That implies it didn't last forever, the magic ran out.
Correct. Even Britain, with all its unique strengths and financial acumen, couldn't defy Ferguson's law indefinitely. In the 20th century, the immense strain and unbelievable cost of World War I, followed by the Great Depression, pushed Britain back over the Ferguson limit in a major sustained way. And this time, its relative power decisively waned, and its empire ultimately crumbled.
So in the interwar years, the 1920s and 30s, Britain was spending more on debt than defense again.
Significantly more, and consistently. World War I caused a 12-fold increase in Britain's national debt, leaving it with enormous annual interest costs, much of it now owed externally, particularly to the United States.
How bad was it?
By 1919, interest payments were nearly 6% of GDP, peaking at 7.5% in 1923. Meanwhile, British defense spending plummeted after 1918. It went from over 10% of GDP during the war down to around 3%, or even less throughout the 1920s, as policymakers ruthlessly prioritized austerity and servicing that massive war debt.
So they crossed the limit again, decisively.
Decisively. In fact, according to historical budget data, from 1920 right through to 1937, every single year saw Britain spending more on debt service than on its military. They had crossed the Ferguson limit in the 1920s, and unlike the 19th century when they actively reduced debt in peacetime, this time they struggled mightily to get back on the right side of it. The sheer scale of the WWI debt and the subsequent economic difficulties made it incredibly hard.
That interwar period must have felt the squeeze intensely. Those physical pressures must have directly impacted strategic choices, right? Leading up to WWII.
It did, and it illustrates the warning power of Ferguson's law really clearly. Burdened by those war debts, the British government pursued strict austerity, often targeting discretionary spending like defense, just to keep up with those crushing interest payments. The result was the infamous 10-year rule.
What was that?
It was a treasury assumption, adopted for planning purposes, that Britain would not face a major war for the next 10 years. This assumption was used to justify deep, sustained defense cuts throughout the 1920s. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin famously vowed that under his government there will be no great armaments, effectively freezing military procurement and modernization for years.
So the military withered.
Significantly. The Royal Air Force, which was the world's largest in 1918, was nearly disbanded by the mid-1920s due to lack of funds. Even the highly prioritized Royal Navy faced such severe pay cuts that it triggered the Invergordon Mutiny in 1931 when sailors protested wage reductions driven by budget tightening.
All while interest payments were huge.
All this happened while the Treasury was struggling under interest expenditures that exceeded 40% of all government outlays in the late 1920s and early 30s. By 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression, Britain's interest payments were consuming over twice as much of GDP as its military spending, 5.5% versus 2.4%. This was Ferguson's law in action. British hard power was literally being choked by the cost of past wars. The empire's strategic overstretch trying to maintain its vast global commitments with an underfunded military became financially impossible to sustain effectively.
And the geopolitical effects followed directly from that underfunding. Appeasement, for instance.
Naturally. In the 1930s, as Britain faced increasingly aggressive expansionist powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, and also growing colonial unrest, it found itself with insufficient military strength due to those years of economizing on defense. The policy of appeasement toward Hitler and the frantic last-minute scramble to rearm in the late 1930s were direct consequences of Britain trying belatedly to recover its military capacity and escape its Ferguson limit crisis.
So Ferguson links that decline directly to the debt burden.
He notes that Britain's imperial decline in the 20th century cannot be understood separately from its leaders' struggle to manage war debt and get back within the law's implied limits. They effectively had to choose between guns and interest, and for a long stretch of the interwar period, interest won out. That significantly weakened Britain's global position and its capacity to deter those rising threats. Defense spending only really ramped up again in the rearmament drive of 1937-39, but by then, arguably, the empire's relative power had already eroded significantly compared to its rivals.
And then came World War II. Victory, but at what cost? Another massive debt burden.
Enormous, and it compounded the interwar fiscal weakness. WWII brought another massive wave of debt, doubling the national debt again. By 1945, Britain was victorious, yes, but financially utterly exhausted. It had amassed over $40 billion in foreign debt, largely owed to the United States, but also to countries like India and Egypt. Britain was effectively bankrupt in terms of its ability to fund its global commitments.
Ferguson has a quote about that, doesn't he?
He does, quite vividly. Once Britain had been the world's banker. Now she owed. The foundations of empire had been simply eaten up by the cost of the war.
So post-1945, Britain faced the Ferguson's Law dilemma again, but even worse.
On steroids, really. Huge interest obligations, plus the political necessity of funding a modern welfare state at home. That was a key priority for the post-war Labour government. So the defense budget, despite the Cold War starting, got squeezed dramatically as a result, compared to Britain's historical global role and past military size.
Even though defense spending as a percentage of GDP was still relatively high.
It averaged around 5.8% of GDP from 1947 to 1987, which was higher than pre-1914 levels. But this was overshadowed by other costs, and the economy itself was burdened with massive debt and the need for rebuilding. The new Labour government in 1945 explicitly prioritized social programs, stating they could only be afforded if Britain's overseas commitments were drastically reduced. The blunt assessment was Britain was bust and the empire was mortgaged to the hilt.
And that fiscal reality, that inability to afford global commitments due to debt and domestic priorities, directly led to the rapid decolonization we saw after the war. India, Africa.
Within a few years, the British Empire, the largest in history, just unraveled with astonishing speed. India gained independence in 1947, followed by dozens of other colonies in Asia and Africa through the 50s and 60s. Now, multiple factors drove decolonization. Obviously, nationalist movements, the anti-colonial stance of the U.S. were huge, but economics was undeniably central.
They just couldn't afford the empire anymore.
As Ferguson notes after WWII, Britain simply could no longer afford an empire. It was too costly to maintain the military forces and administrative structure needed to control it. The empire, in his words, effectively crumbled under a mountain of debt. London ceded ground not just to independence movements, but also to pure economic reality.
So the final collapse was hastened by Ferguson's law dynamics, choosing debt and welfare over empire.
Ferguson argues strongly that yes, the government chose to service debt and build the welfare state rather than devote sufficient resources to try and reimpose imperial control or maintain that vast global military footprint. The United States also played a role, discouraging Britain from holding on to colonies through the Atlantic Charter principles and post-war pressure. By the 1960s, the once dominant British Empire had, as Ferguson puts it, wilted under the combined pressure of foreign debt and the Cold War.
So the British case really shows both sides. It shows how temporary recovery from crossing the Ferguson limit is possible through extraordinary institutional strength and fiscal effort. But it also shows how eventually the cumulative weight of debt, especially from major wars, can become too much to bear, leading to strategic retreat and the end of an era.
Precisely. In the 19th century, Britain's unique strengths helped it manage debt and sustain superpower status despite periods above the limit. But in the 20th century, 2 world wars pushed it decisively beyond the limit, leaving it burdened by debt it couldn't outgrow or pay down significantly in peacetime. The empire never fully recovered its financial or strategic footing. Massive debt servicing needs, interwar and post-war, forced strategic retreats from appeasement to decolonization, marking the end of its imperial era. Ferguson's law offers this powerful unifying lens. Whenever Britain spent significantly more on debt service than on its armed forces 1780s, parts of the 1820s-30s, consistently 1920-37, post-1945, an era of imperial contraction or crisis followed. Reversing course is possible, but history suggests it might only prolong, not permanently prevent, decline when faced with repeated shocks. Britain's 19th century resurgence is the rare exception that managed to step back from the brink for a century before a new crisis pushed it back over.
Let's recap this section on recovery. Can an empire recover after crossing the Ferguson limit? History suggests it's incredibly rare. Most empires seem to spiral downwards into decline or collapse.
That's the dominant pattern, yes.
But the British Empire showed this notable partial exception in the 19th century. It bought itself about a century of dominance through specific, extraordinary strategies: sound financial institutions, effective taxation, disciplined post-war fiscal management, actually paying down the debt and consistently prioritizing core defense needs, especially the Navy.
They pull it off for a while against the odds.
But even Britain couldn't defy the law forever. The cumulative debt burden from the world wars in the 20th century pushed them back over, contributing to decline and strategic retreat. So the historical precedent for a permanent full reversal after consistently crossing the threshold, it appears bleak.
The evidence across centuries and continents is certainly sobering when you look at the pattern consistently. Fiscal limits eventually seem to impose strategic limits.
Which brings us directly back to the United States. Back to that striking FY 2024 milestone, where U.S. federal net interest payments officially surpassed defense spending. This point, where the cost of past borrowing now exceeds the budget for current and future security, it just resonates so deeply with these historical theories linking fiscal stress to imperial decline.
It really does. By crossing that limit in FY 2024, the U.S. has, according to the Ferguson's Law framework and these historical parallels we've just walked through, entered what looks like historically precarious fiscal territory.
And the mechanisms of decline that Ferguson proposes, they become potential risks for the U.S. now.
Things like the diversion of scarce national resources away from defense and investment, potentially signaling weakness to rivals, reducing effective power projection capabilities, maybe even risking internal instability down the line if fiscal strain leads to harsh austerity or political deadlock. These are all potential risks that align with this moment. The historical example showed this isn't just theoretical, it's a pattern with real-world consequences.
And Ferguson's Law isn't the only theory that sees fiscal stress as a potential sign of a turning point or even decline for a great power, is it? There are others.
That's true. Some analysts might bring in theories like Giovanni Arrighi's concept of hegemonic cycles. Arrighi looked at the post-1970s U.S. economy, particularly its increasing financialization, the growing importance of finance relative to making things, and rising debt levels, both public and private. And he interpreted that as a possible sign of a declining hegemon entering a phase of financial expansion as its productive dominance maybe slows relative to rivals.
So from that perspective, current U.S. fiscal pressures, the surging role of interest payments, could be seen as more evidence of this late-stage financialization, a symptom of deeper shifts.
It could be interpreted that way, yes, as further evidence of that phase. And then there's Paul Kennedy's very influential idea of imperial overstretch.
I remember that book, where commitments outstrip capacity.
Kennedy argued that great powers often decline when their global commitments, their military ambitions, their strategic responsibilities expand to exceed their underlying economic capacity to sustain them over the long term. This overextension frequently leads to excessive military spending, high levels of national debt, persistent fiscal strain, creating an economic burden that ultimately undermines the very foundations of their power.
So the question becomes, does the U.S.'s current situation, vast global military commitments, huge alliance networks, significant and growing debt, does that align with Kennedy's concept? Is the FY 2024 crossover a flashing light indicating that the U.S. has finally overstretched fiscally relative to its capacity?
It's a question these historical frameworks and the current data powerfully prompt us to ask.
So there's certainly significant weight to these historical analogies and these theoretical frameworks, even if, the current context is unique in many ways.
They provide a really powerful cautionary framework for interpreting the U.S. situation. Now, historical contexts are never identical to the present. The global economy, the nature of war, financial systems are vastly different today than in Habsburg Spain or even 20th century Britain. But that recurring pattern fiscal stress, especially characterized by debt service, costs rivaling or exceeding military spending, preceding or accompanying periods of national decline, that provides a significant warning signal.
It elevates the debate beyond just economics or politics.
It really does. It elevates the current debate about U.S. deficits and debt beyond just economics or partisan squabbling to one about fundamental national power, global standing, and the long-term capacity of the state itself to function effectively and securely.
But the U.S. is unique in many significant ways, especially its role right at the center of the global financial system. Are there counterarguments, specific factors that might give the U.S. a degree of resilience, maybe a capacity to defy this historical pattern that past empires simply didn't have?
And it's crucial we consider these unique attributes and counterpoints when applying historical analogies. Direct comparisons, while illustrative, really must be approached with caution precisely because there are significant, even unprecedented differences today. Differences in global finance, the nature and ownership of U.S. debt, its political system compared to historical empires.
Like the status of the U.S. dollar, that seems like the biggest difference.
That's perhaps the single most significant difference. and it's a key argument often made for American resilience. The US dollar's status as the world's primary reserve currency, the dominant currency for international trade and finance, it's unparalleled in history. No previous empire, not even Britain at its peak with sterling, held such a central, indispensable role in the global financial system.
And that gives the U.S. a unique advantage, the exorbitant privilege.
That phrase, coined by former French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, captures it well. Global demand for dollar assets, especially safe assets like U.S. Treasury securities, creates this uniquely deep, liquid, and robust market for U.S. government debt. Central banks, sovereign wealth funds, private investors worldwide consistently buy and hold U.S. Treasuries.
And that makes it significantly easier and cheaper for the U.S. government to borrow huge amounts of money.
This extraordinary global demand allows the U.S. government to borrow much more easily and often at lower interest rates than other nations would be able to with comparable or even lower levels of debt relative to their economies. Some estimates suggest this exorbitant privilege could reduce U.S. interest costs by anywhere from 10 to 30 basis points. That's 0.1% and 0.3% compared to what they might otherwise be. And maybe more importantly, it might allow the U.S. to sustain a higher overall volume of debt, perhaps as much as 22% higher debt to GDP than it otherwise could before facing a real crisis. This definitely enhances the near-term sustainability of the U.S. debt load.
But is that exorbitant privilege guaranteed? Is it immutable? Can it last forever, regardless of U.S. fiscal choices?
That's the million-dollar or maybe trillion-dollar question. And no, it's not guaranteed to last indefinitely. While its dominance is currently secure, there are ongoing discussions of potential long-term risks to the dollar's status.
Such as?
Well, things like the rise of other major economic powers, particularly China, and its efforts, however slow, to internationalize the yuan. Ongoing efforts by some nations are blocks towards de-dollarization in trade settlements or reserve holdings. The sheer magnitude of the U.S. debt burden itself could eventually undermine long-term confidence if it's perceived as uncontrollable, and broader geopolitical shifts that might fragment global economic blocs.
So the trend needs watching.
Definitely. While no immediate challenger is poised to supplant the dollar tomorrow, its share in officially reported global foreign exchange reserves has declined gradually. It was over 70% in the early 2000s. Now it's around 58-60% in recent years. These trends, though slow, need careful monitoring. Any significant erosion of the dollar's status would remove a key pillar of U.S. fiscal resilience.
What about the nature of U.S. debt itself? You mentioned ownership. How does that differ from, say, the Ottomans borrowing from European bankers?
That's another mitigating factor. A substantial portion of U.S. public debt is actually held domestically by American individuals, institutions like pension funds, insurance companies, and even the Federal Reserve itself through its quantitative easing programs.
And the U.S. borrows in its own currency.
Yes. The U.S. government borrows in U.S. dollars. This provides significantly greater monetary policy flexibility to manage debt obligations compared to historical empires, like the Ottomans or even Spain at times, that relied heavily on foreign lenders using foreign currencies, or were tied to finite commodity reserves like gold or silver. The ability, at least in theory, for the central bank to manage debt through actions like quantitative easing, printing money, essentially, though it carries serious inflation risks, as we've seen, is a policy tool unavailable to states borrowing in currencies they don't control.
Some analysts even critique Ferguson's law on this point, right? Focusing on foreign debt.
Yes. Some critiques, like one by Emiliano Brancaccio, suggest that focusing solely on total public debt might be misplaced for a modern reserve currency issuer like the U.S. He emphasizes the role of foreign-held debt, both public and private, as potentially a greater constraint on a hegemon's power. Servicing foreign debt requires constantly attracting and retaining international capital, which can limit your domestic monetary policy autonomy and impose stricter fiscal discipline than domestically held debt might. From this perspective, the ratio for a modern power might be military spending relative to foreign debt service, rather than total debt service. It's a valid nuance to consider.
That's an interesting point. It's not just the total debt, but who holds it and what currency it's in that really matters for how constrained you are.
It implies a different level of constraint compared to historical empires heavily reliant on foreign bankers and foreign currencies. And just more broadly, many analysts argue that these U.S. decline narratives, including those based on historical patterns like Ferguson's law, are often overstated when applied too deterministically.
They point to enduring U.S. strengths.
Yes, things like the enduring strengths of the U.S. economy, its continued global leadership and technological innovation, the simple fact that there isn't a clear, single successor hegemon ready to seamlessly take over the U.S.'s global roles, and the deep integration of the U.S. in the global economic, financial, and security architecture.
The whole American exceptionalism argument.
That idea often comes up in this context, yeah. Questioning whether the unique attributes of the U.S., its geography, dynamic society, political system, economic structure, make these historical analogies of imperial decline less applicable in a strict predictive sense. Now, the current fiscal situation is widely acknowledged as serious and unsustainable long-term under current policies. But a predetermined, inevitable path to decline based solely on historical comparisons is definitely debated. It requires a nuanced view that carefully considers these unique U.S.-specific factors.
Let's dig a bit more into those unique U.S. strengths and mitigating factors beyond the dollar. You mentioned economic dynamism and innovation capacity. That seems key.
It is a key one, and a potential source of significant resilience. The U.S. economy has historically been characterized by dynamism, a strong entrepreneurial spirit, and this leading, often pioneering role in tech innovation across many sectors. These attributes can contribute significantly to fiscal resilience over the long term.
Wow. Through growth?
Primarily, yes. Sustained increases in productivity and technological advancement can lead to higher potential economic growth. Higher growth expands the national income and the tax base, even without raising tax rates. This allows the economy to potentially outgrow its debt over time, making the debt-to-GDP ratio more manageable without resorting to painful austerity measures.
And U.S. tech leadership in areas like AI, biotech, etc., plays directly into that potential for growth.
U.S. leadership in critical, cutting-edge technologies can spur whole new industries, create high-value jobs, enhance overall economic competitiveness and productivity. This innovation has the potential to generate significant new wealth and new revenue streams for the government and improve efficiency across the economy. If you couple that with a culture that generally encourages risk-taking, investment in relatively flexible labor and capital markets, the U.S. economy has shown a historical capacity to adapt to changing conditions and capitalize on new opportunities.
So these factors can help mitigate fiscal challenges.
They can, by fostering stronger underlying growth, which helps the debt-to-GDP ratio and increases government revenues naturally. But, and this is important, it requires continued smart investment in things like education, basic research and development, and policies that actually support innovation, competition, and broad-based economic participation. It's not automatic.
And what about that historical capacity for fiscal reform and adaptation you mentioned? Is that something we can realistically rely on to solve the current situation given today's politics?
Well, the United States does have a track record historically of implementing significant fiscal reforms in response to past challenges. It shows a capacity for adaptation and collective action when faced with perceived crises. We mentioned the huge efforts to reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio after World War II through growth and fiscal restraint. And the bipartisan budget agreements and eventual surpluses of the 1990s are another notable example.
So the tools are there.
The governmental institutions, Congress, the executive branch, the Federal Reserve, despite all the current political challenges and polarization, they still possess the constitutional and legal tools to enact corrective fiscal and monetary policies. And potentially, as the fiscal situation becomes more salient, as its impacts become more apparent, maybe through higher interest rates hitting mortgages or crowding out other spending, public awareness and concern could grow. That could possibly create the political will needed for policymakers to undertake difficult but necessary reforms to spending or revenue.
Things like those bipartisan fiscal commissions that get proposed sometimes.
That's one potential mechanism people talk about, yeah. To try and forge some consensus on addressing unsustainable entitlement spending growth or tax reform outside the regular, often gridlocked budget process.
So these unique strengths, the dollar's global status, the economic dynamism, this historical capacity for reform, they offer real, tangible resilience and options that weren't available to past empires.
They provide the U.S. with a degree of fiscal space, flexibility, and resilience that many other nations, and certainly most historical empires we discussed, simply did not possess. They offer a wider range of policy options and probably a longer runway before hitting a hard wall compared to states borrowing in foreign currencies or lacking deep domestic capital markets.
But there's a paradox there, isn't there? That very resilience, that longer runway, could actually breed a dangerous complacency. It could delay needed action until it's too late, or the adjustments needed are much more painful.
That's precisely the risk, and it's a major concern highlighted by many fiscal analysts. These strengths should not be mistaken for some kind of ironclad guarantee against fiscal distress or a free pass to borrow indefinitely without consequence. They can, paradoxically, breed complacency among policymakers and the public. They might make it easier to delay necessary proactive fiscal adjustments, whether that's spending cuts, revenue increases, or both, until a crisis makes them unavoidable. And crisis-driven adjustments are often more abrupt, more painful, and potentially more economically damaging than gradual plan changes would have been earlier.
So the very factors that offer resilience could, if we over-rely on them without proactive management.
They could fail to prevent a more severe reckoning down the road if those underlying imbalances remain unaddressed and just keep compounding over time. It's the difference between using your strength to prevent a problem versus using your strength to simply defer the problem until it becomes much, much larger.
And this is all happening right in the middle of some very contentious policy debates in Washington.
It is. That FY 2024 milestone occurred within a very dynamic and contentious policy environment. The budget processes for FY 2024 and the ongoing discussions for FY 2025 have been heavily influenced by concerns over rising interest costs and how they impact both defense and non-defense discretionary spending. We saw the Fiscal Responsibility Act in 2023, which resolved the debt ceiling standoff, imposed those statutory caps on discretionary spending, further constraining allocations. And the debt ceiling itself remains this recurring point of potential political leverage and fiscal disruption hanging over everything.
What's the consensus among the experts right now on the U.S. fiscal situation? Has everyone basically agreed on the path forward, or is there still a lot of debate?
Well, there's a very broad consensus among most nonpartisan fiscal analysts. Think the CBO, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, organizations like the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, that the current U.S. fiscal trajectory is unsustainable in the long term if current policies remain unchanged. The projections consistently show rising debt-to-GDP ratios and persistent large deficits under current law, and those projections look even worse if expiring tax cuts are extended without being paid for.
Unsustainable long-term is the consensus, but do they agree on how immediate the risk is or what the solutions should be?
That's where the divergence really lies, and it reflects the complexity of the problem and the immense political difficulty in fixing it. Views differ significantly on the immediacy of the risk of a full-blown fiscal crisis and on the precise package of solutions required.
So some are more pessimistic, warning bells ringing loudly.
Yes, some experts are definitely more pessimistic. They warn of serious economic and national security risks that could materialize relatively soon. Things like slower economic growth because government borrowing crowds out private investment, reduced fiscal space to respond to the next crisis, whether it's a recession, a war, a pandemic, potentially higher borrowing costs across the economy, and an increased likelihood of a sudden fiscal crisis if corrective actions aren't taken relatively soon.
While others are more optimistic, or at least less alarmist in the short term.
Others hold a more optimistic or perhaps nuanced view. They tend to emphasize the U.S.'s unique strengths. Again, the dollar's role, the depth of U.S. capital markets, suggesting the U.S. can manage higher debt levels than other countries for longer, without triggering an immediate catastrophic crisis. Provided, and this is a caveat, provided that U.S. institutions remain strong, the dollar's global status isn't seriously undermined, and the fiscal trajectory doesn't worsen dramatically beyond what's currently projected.
Any examples of that more nuanced view?
An analysis from the Brookings Institution, for example, suggested that while high debt will likely erode the capital stock and living standards gradually over time, the risk of a severe, enduring fiscal crisis in the coming decades appears relatively low, as long as those conditions, strong institutions, dollar dominance, no massive unforeseen fiscal shocks hold.
So it's not necessarily a guaranteed sudden crash tomorrow, but it's definitely a serious risk that needs careful proactive management. And there's debate about the timeline and the exact trigger point.
And a recurring theme in many analyses, which links back to some of those historical cases like France, is that a fiscal crisis in a modern democracy like the US is perhaps more likely to be triggered by political missteps, things like an accidental default because of a debt ceiling impasse, or maybe sudden, massive, unfinanced policy changes that really shock financial markets, rather than by purely economic factors hitting some specific predetermined debt threshold level in isolation.
Which puts the focus squarely on political leadership and the ability to compromise.
Yeah, it really underscores the importance of political leadership, the capacity for bipartisan compromise, however difficult that seems right now, and effective governance in achieving the necessary fiscal reforms. The underlying economic reality is serious, but the political response, or lack thereof, is perhaps the more uncertain variable in the equation.
And that divergence in views about the urgency, about the specific mix of spending cuts versus tax increases, makes achieving consensus incredibly difficult in the current political climate.
It does. It's this complex interplay of economic theory, political ideology, deeply held beliefs about the role of government, and just the sheer practicalities of policymaking when trying to address a fiscal situation of this magnitude. It's not just an academic exercise, it's about navigating the real-world constraints and incredibly difficult choices imposed by these fiscal realities on our democratic system.
It makes you think, what would you do if you were a policymaker in Washington today and you're seeing these powerful historical patterns from Spain, France, the Ottomans, Britain, and then you see the United States hitting this fiscal crossover point in FY 2024, how would you even begin to balance it all? The urgent need to address rising interest costs that are crowding out everything else, the undeniable need for a robust defense in a dangerous world, the legitimate demands for domestic spending and investment, and the need to somehow preserve and leverage America's unique economic strengths, like the dollar's role. It requires incredibly difficult choices, doesn't it?
It certainly does. There are no easy answers here, and history shows pretty clearly that the choices made, or perhaps the choices not made, the problems allowed to fester at these kinds of junctures have really long-lasting, profound consequences for a nation's power, its security, and its place in the world.
But let's try to pull this all together in a final mega recap. Can an empire recover after crossing the Ferguson limit, where interest exceeds defense spending?
History suggests incredibly rarely. Most empires seem to spiral downwards into decline or collapse.
The British Empire showed that partial exception in the 19th century, right? Buying itself a century of dominance through specific strategies. Strong financial institutions, effective taxation, disciplined post-war debt reduction, and prioritizing the Navy.
Yes, they managed a temporary escape, a remarkable feat.
But even that wasn't permanent immunity. The costs of 20th century wars pushed Britain back over the limit, contributing to its decline and strategic retreat. The historical precedent for a permanent reversal seems bleak.
Very bleak, yes.
Now, the U.S. finds itself at this historical crossroads in 2024. The historical parallels are sobering. Ferguson's law, Arrighi's cycles, Kennedy's overstretch, they all seem relevant.
They provide a worrying framework for sure.
But the U.S. does have unique strength. The dollar's global role, economic dynamism and innovation, a history of reform capacity, these might offer resilience.
They definitely offer potential resilience and more options than past empires had.
But the huge question remains, are these strengths enough to truly defy historical gravity? Or do they just breed complacency, leading to a last gasp rather than escape velocity? That seems to be the profound question facing policymakers, and really all of us today. It's a debate about the nation's capacity to manage its future and its position in the world.
And just to reinforce those key takeaways, maybe some flashcard facts for you listening.
Good idea. First, Ferguson's law itself. Interest payments, military spending, risk of imperial decline.
FY 2024. That's the year U.S. federal interest payments officially surpassed defense spending for the first time post-WWI. Think of roughly $870 billion in interest versus $822 billion in defense, using comparable CBO-CRFB figures.
Historical pattern. Remember Spain, France, the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary, they all declined after crossing the limit.
More Britain's 19th century recovery. They achieved it through robust financial institutions, effective taxation, post-war fiscal discipline, actually paying down debt, and continued military prioritization, especially the Navy.
I bet. But Britain's 20th century reality. Debt from WWI and WWII pushed interest over defense again, consistently from 1920-37 and after 1945. This contributed to strategic retreats like appeasement and decolonization, and the loss of superpower status.
A key U.S. drivers for the FY24 crossover: rapid debt accumulation from long-term imbalances plus recent policies, ARP, IIJA, debated IRA impact, TCJA effects, combined with that sharp rise in interest rates due to the Fed fighting inflation.
And the unique U.S. strengths that might make things different. The dollar's reserve status, exorbitant privilege, economic dynamism and innovation potential, and that historical capacity for fiscal reform.
Which leaves the big question: can these U.S. strengths defy historical gravity? Or will these fiscal imbalances ultimately undermine America's future security and global standing, just as history suggests often happens?
That FY 2024 milestone, where U.S. federal net interest payments surpassed outlays for national defense, it really is a stark and historically significant marker, isn't it? It's not some isolated anomaly. It feels like the tangible result of decades of cumulative fiscal decisions amplified dramatically by recent economic shocks and policy responses.
It signals a new and definitely challenging era for U.S. budgetary priorities. And the implications, as we've discussed, go far beyond just accounting. They touch directly on the core of national power, strategic capacity, global standing.
The primary drivers that rapidly accumulated debt, fueled by policies and underlying imbalances, combined with the sharp rise in borrowing costs, they fundamentally altered the government's financial landscape, its flexibility.
And consequently, an increasing, unavoidable portion of national resources is now dedicated simply to servicing past obligations. That inevitably constrains the resources available for current and future priorities, including defense investment, domestic public investments in infrastructure or education, and even the capacity to respond effectively to unforeseen crises, whether they're economic or strategic.
The significance of this crossover feels multifaceted. Budgetarily, it highlights that crowding out effect we talked about, non-discretionary interest payments limiting fiscal flexibility, forcing tough trade-offs in discretionary spending.
And for national security, it raises fundamental concerns about the long-term capacity to fund defense adequately, modernize forces, project power effectively, especially in an era defined by intensifying strategic competition and evolving global threats.
And historically, as we've spent a lot of time exploring, this pattern resonates powerfully with those theories of great power decline. It suggests a potentially precarious path if these trends aren't addressed.
However, as we also discussed, the U.S. trajectory isn't necessarily a predetermined, inevitable path to decline just because it crossed this historical threshold. The nation does possess unique strengths.
The dollar, the dynamic economy, the history of reform.
Those factors provide a degree of resilience and a wider range of policy options than were available to many historical empires that eventually succumbed to debt. Critiques of applying historical analogies too directly often emphasize these unique American attributes. They suggest that while the fiscal challenges are undeniably serious and require action, predetermined, catastrophic outcomes aren't necessarily inevitable, at least not in the near to medium term, provided prudent choices are made.
The current policy landscape really reflects this tension and complexity, doesn't it? There's broad agreement among experts on the long-term unsustainability if policies don't change.
But significant debate exists about the precise urgency of the threat and the optimal politically achievable solutions. Should the emphasis be more on spending cuts, revenue increases, trying to foster faster economic growth, or some mix?
And the choices made, or maybe, as history suggests, the choices not made, allowing the problem to fester in the coming years regarding spending, revenue, debt management, they feel critical. They seem like key determinants of the nation's future capacity.
They involve not just complex economic calculations, but fundamental questions about the role of government, fairness between generations, and America's strategic priorities in a changing world.
Ultimately, this FY 2024 milestone really highlights the profound, unavoidable intersection of fiscal reality and geopolitical destiny. The nation's ability to manage its finances, make prudent policy choices, foster sustainable economic growth, it feels like the key determinant of its capacity to maintain global leadership, ensure national security, and secure prosperity for future generations.
Navigating this new fiscal reality requires a clear-eyed assessment of the challenges, a willingness to engage in difficult policy debates with intellectual honesty, and a sustained commitment to long-term fiscal stewardship. It's going to test the resilience of American institutions and the ability of its political system to forge consensus on issues that are just of paramount national importance.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to carry forward, a question that kind of hangs over all the data and all the history we've discussed. If history strongly suggests that empires prioritizing debt service over defense are effectively living on borrowed time and often face decline, and the U.S. has now definitively reached that point, what does this imply for the global balance of power in the coming decades? What happens to the world if the dominant global power finds itself increasingly constrained not primarily by external rivals, but by its own internal financial obligations?
Or maybe an even more unsettling question. History shows that while temporary recovery from this fiscal tipping point is possible, through extraordinary effort and unique circumstances, like 19th century Britain, a permanent escape from the long-term consequences of massive debt hasn't really occurred for great powers. Does the U.S.'s unique position today simply buy it more time than previous empires had? Or does it face a reckoning that, when it eventually arrives, if these imbalances aren't corrected, could be unlike anything history has shown us, precisely because its global financial role is so central and interconnected? What happens when the linchpin feels the strain?
When Spain hit the limit, it defaulted. When the Ottomans crossed it, they lost control of their own treasury. When Britain breached it, the empire unraveled. The United States is not those empires. Its advantages are real, but so is the math. If debt is money, and interest is the price of yesterday's ambition, then we're entering an era where security, policy, and power must now answer to the bond market. Hear how this arithmetic plays out across the rest of the economy, from banks and bonds to the quiet leverage beneath the American middle class.
Please like and subscribe.